First and foremost, thank you so much for coming out. This is our third Pride Talk, and I would say that each and every one of them has been absolutely phenomenal. We started off speaking about masculinity. We then spoke about race and class and privilege. And now we're going to be continuing that dialogue with Dr. Eric Castillo, who is the Assistant Dean and Director of our Houston campus, speaking about race and place in the Ivory Tower. I, for one, am looking very forward to this dialogue and conversation because I have never worked anywhere else except the Ivory Tower. And thinking about my space and my role has been something that I have thought about for a number of years. So, Eric, we're going to turn it over to you. The way that we typically have this is we've got about 12 to 15 minutes for you to share your talk with us. Then we'll open it up to the floor for some Q&A. All right, so Eric, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. And thank you so much for kind of being here on the Springfield College campus here in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Awesome. Good morning. Buenos dias, everybody. Thank you so much. I didn't realize it was a 12 to 15 minute time limit, so I will put on my running shoes for this presentation, and I will move as swiftly as possible. Thank you, Dr. Hill and Lisa, for coordinating and creating this series of Pride Talks. I'm honored that I have been selected for this public presentation today. I want to start off by saying that I am honored to represent my brothers and sisters at the regional campuses. It's not often that we get this type of platform with the main campus, so I hope that I do my best to represent our collective wisdom, insight, and contributions to the main campus. I also want to say that it is such an honor to represent my brothers and sisters inside and outside of higher education who are actively fighting for racial justice and the liberation of all peoples. And I'd like to dedicate this Pride Talk today to my incredible students at the mighty Houston campus who allow me to bear witness every single day to their resilience, to their perseverance, to their intelligence, and to their own commitment to transforming society. They impress me and they motivate me every single day. In the words of Florian Saldúa, vale la pena. So we know that this work is not easy and it's a challenge, but it's worth the pain and the struggle. So we're gonna kind of go toggle back and forth between my PowerPoint presentation and this charming smile. So just be patient with me, kind of me back and forth a little bit. Let me get my screen shared. And let's click on here. Okay. So my full name is Dr. Eric Tomas Muñoz Martinez Hernandez Castillo. You can call me Eric Castillo for short. And a little bit about myself. I am born and raised in the south side of San Antonio, Texas. Mi papa was a farm worker, a Vietnam War veteran, and a city employee. Mi ama was a domestic and garment worker, a retail cashier, and a vault teller. I am a second generation Chicano Mexicano whose antepasados come from San Luis Potosí and Puebla, Mexico. I am a first generation college graduate and first in the family with a PhD. So a little story is public artwork really transformed my life. I remember that when I was a little kid, we'd be driving from the south side of San Antonio to the west side to visit my abuelita. And for those unfamiliar with San Antonio, south and west side are predominantly and proudly Mexicano. And so when I would drive to my grandma's house, my family, I remember seeing these beautiful murals adorning all the different buildings and the parks. And these images had images of brown folks. It had cultural and religious icons and images that spoke to my culture and to my heritage. And I remember feeling represented. I felt empowered, I felt motivated, I felt included, affirmed, and celebrated. I felt documented. And it was a very powerful experience for me growing up. And as I shifted into education as a student, a pupil, and as an educator, now an administrator, those feelings of affirmation have largely been absent from my experience. You know, what I received from my community was not present in education. My community was not represented or affirmed or celebrated, nor was our history documented. So it wasn't until at some point I really realized for myself that wisdom sits in places and not within institutions. And so it was really important for me to think about this and to understand the level of knowledge.
When I go to these stores, they get them for free.
For those of you that are on Zoom, if you could please mute yourself. Thank you so much. So it was was really motivating to me to see that the amount of wisdom and insight, intelligence that came from my elders and from my community, and that reminded me, and that gave me a critical insight as how I would approach my work towards social justice in higher education. I share that with you just to say that experiential or situated knowledge is central to my professional, spiritual, and organizing work. And in terms of career, higher education has been my home for the past 14 years, give or take. So why critique a place that I call home? And to answer this question, I want to invoke the brilliance, the fire, and the passion of James Baldwin when he spoke about his love for this country. He wrote, "I love America more than any other country in this world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to critique her perpetually." So I borrow from James and I say, I love higher education more than any other profession that I know, and for exactly this reason, I insist on the right to criticize it perpetually. Now, a note about context, folks. We're all approaching this talk today from a multiple perspectives, lenses, disciplines, and backgrounds. So it's important to say this. How you understand your role at our institution and how you understand the role of institutions will help conceptualize the value and function of this talk. So with that being said, let's dive in. Race in place in the ivory towers, justice in action in higher education. So why are we taking a critical look at higher ed? At a time in this country when it is in catastrophic and tumultuous state, when white supremacy is overt and sinister and violent and sanctioned and supported, when multiple overlapping systems of power, domination, and control are sharpening their gaze onto oppressed populations and are placing them, us, in their crosshairs. And at a time when higher education is in significant flux, both locally and globally, we're seeing the corporatization and business model of education, the targeted closure and censorship of ethnic studies, women's studies, performance studies, liberal arts and humanities studies programs. And even Springfield College right now is going through a significant reorganization, and how it chooses to carve its path moving forward will reveal our commitment to social transformation and social and economic justice. But, excuse me, in addition to that, we're also seeing waves of revolutionary leaders and social movements. With this recent midterm elections, we've seen a significant increase of women of color, Muslims, Native Americans, and LGBT folks who are now in positions of authority. And we're also seeing new and re-energized social movements like Black Lives Matter, indigenous movements, a new voting bloc of youth and millennials, and undocumented folks fighting for liberation. So really, it's important that we call into question higher education. What are we doing to lead us towards a more just, decolonial, and liberatory society? But to do so, we really have to look to the past and the history of higher ed to understand where we're at and where we're going. So I'm going to give a very incredibly brief and not comprehensive history of higher education. So I will speak as slowly as possible, but we will be moving pretty quickly through this. So in the book, Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's Universities, Craig Wilder writes about how the founding, financing, and development of higher education in colonial territories were thoroughly intertwined with the economic and social forces that transformed West and Central Africa through the slave trade and devastated indigenous nations in the Americas. Educational institutions were created to secure colonial interests, exploit the decline of Indian nations, and justify the rise of African slavery. Higher ed was the cornerstone of intellectual inquiry during colonization in this country. Higher ed was also a conspirator and legitimizing slavery, genocide, and oppression. And it was not only dependent upon enslavement, but it became the breeding ground for racist ideas that sustained it. So higher ed refined these racist ideas and popularized the language of race, providing an intellectual cover for the social and political subjugation of non-white peoples. And for all of us that know, Harvard University was the first official formal place of higher education in this country. In 1636, it was established. And Harvard serves to educate a very small segment of people in the colonized territories, namely white, wealthy, Protestant, straight men. And so Harvard served as a central legitimizing force for the intellectual argument for slavery. Now, Harvard needed an inexpensive and an expendable workforce. It brought the administrators, it had the faculty, and it had the students. to run the institution, but it needed people, bodies, and a workforce to help the institution run. And so they found value in the idea of slavery as an inexpensive and expendable workforce. And during the colonial empire also needed an institutional support for enslavement. They had the economic argument in place for why they were going to create a racial hierarchy and subjugate Africans and Native Americans, but they needed to have an additional layer of authority, an intellectual force supporting this drive for slavery. So it looked to the universities. And also religious institutions at the time were weaponized and were self-weaponizing to perpetuate these racist ideologies. So thus we see a multiply beneficial relationship that ensured the success of colonization by enforcing power over spirits, minds, and bodies of people. And Harvard, Yale, and Queens College, what we now know as Columbia, worked on developing different kinds of pseudosciences that would measure racial hierarchy, commonly known as phrenology, measuring skull size and shape, and its perceived connection to intelligence and superiority. Samuel Morton and other scholars were engaged in the level of scientific racism by creating a taxonomy of anatomies in creation of and contingent upon the social and political constructions of race. Now, a really cool book by Stephen Jay Gould called The Mismeasure of Man debunks and critiques these methods and motivations for underlying biological determinism, which was the idea that social and economic differences between groups, race, class, and sex, arise from inherited, inborn distinctions. Now, what Gould's book finds out and studies and investigates is that these scholars at Harvard, at Yale, and Queens College were studying skulls and looking at brain cavity, how high or how low the brow was for the face, and other features of the skull to determine racial hierarchy. And they were arguing that the bigger the brain cavity, the more space for brain, which meant more intelligence. The higher the brow of the skull meant that there was came from a higher civilization. And it's that same kind of rhetoric of high arts, low arts, highbrow, lowbrow culture that is a descendant of this type of intellectual, well, pseudo-intellectual discourse. And so when these researchers were finding that, when they were finding African skulls and Native American skulls had a bigger brain cavity than the European skulls, they swapped the skulls around and tampered with the data to enforce this sort of white racial superiority and this racial hierarchy. And for all of us that know this, folks, this is fake news, alt facts. Scholars say, what? We know this is not to be true. We know in the 21st century, this stuff is totally and incredulously false. However, it was higher education. It was these first institutions in our country that were perpetuating and creating and disseminating this type of intellectual knowledge. It's the same knowledge that informed Nazi Germany during the genocide of millions of Jews. It's the same information that informed and shaped the eugenics movement. And it's the same information that we see in the 21st century when people talk about Black and brown bodies. And folks, as much as I love Springfield College is begotten from this lineage. We are a descendant of a history of higher education. And it's important that we understand and question and look to our past so that we can work to transform and change where we're headed and what we've done since then. We may not have been a part of that initial legacy, but a vine cannot produce fruit if it's not connected to the tree. And we are connected to a tree that has a very troubled past. So I'm going to broaden the scope just a little bit to talk more about education. So American Indian boarding schools in the late 1800s were created to institutionalize, socialize, and westernize Native youth. That's a euphemism if I've ever heard it. Native children were kidnapped, abused, and indoctrinated. And the whole goal was to eradicate their indigenous knowledge, culture, and identity, which equates to a cultural and spiritual genocide. Captain Pratt was known for saying, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And this is the picture of Yakima Indian Reservation School in Washington State in 1900. These Native American boys and girls were ripped from their parents' arms, were extracted from their communities, from their homes, and placed within these institutional cages that refused to allow them to speak their culture, to speak their language, practice their culture, and to really stay connected to their identity. And that sounds a lot like what's happening right now in the 21st century along the US-Mexico border. So these things seem to kind of keep replicating themselves throughout time. For us, we all know this, Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. was a Supreme Court decision that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation. And it made segregating everything legally protected in the United States until Alvarez versus Board of Trustees at Lemon Grove School District in San Diego County. Mexican American families were pushing against racially segregated Mexican American schools in San Diego. And California state law supported this and said that segregating Mexican American kids violated the law. Now, this was a 24-year ruling that took precedent prior to Brown versus Board of Education, which was the landmark Supreme Court case that said segregated schools were wrong. Now, to credit Brown versus Board, it was important in helping to provide the legal backing for desegregation, but law cannot change the sociology, the psychology, and the culture of a society. And so all that Brown versus Board kind of did was just place Black and brown youth into very hostile environments that did not have culturally relevant curriculum, programs and services that supported them, faculty, staff, and administration that would affirm and support and advocate on their behalf. We're going to jump really quickly to the civil rights movement. In 1969, the Chicano Coordinating Council wrote a 155-page manifesto demanding Chicano studies education in colleges and universities. Students, faculty, and staff and community members lobbied and organized and protested and organized around demanding to have a space for themselves, demanding education that was culturally relevant. And UC Santa Barbara was one of the first of many places to have Chicano studies. And this became part of that groundswell for ethnic studies and women's studies programs across the country. At the University of Florida, African American students were also demanding for inclusion, representation, programs, and services. And they escalated their demands to university administration. And on April 15th, 1971, known as Black Friday, African American students and their allies marched into and conducted a sit-in at the president's office in Tigard Hall, demanding that their request be honored. University administration said no, had students arrested and kicked out of the building. So because of that incident, in 1971, over 90% of African Americans withdrew from the University of Florida. 90%. So you can only guess that very next year, the Institute of Black Culture was created. Education in the 21st century, kind of speeding through here. For those familiar, Tucson Unified ISD had a 60% graduation rate for its Mexican American students, and it developed a Mexican American Studies program to create culturally relevant content for their Mexican American students and all students at Tucson Unified. And with the implementation of this program, they had a graduation rate of 97%, which was powerhouse for Tucson Unified. But some folks felt that this was encouraging nationalist rhetoric, and House Bill 2281 was passed, which banned all ethnic studies courses and programs in literature in public classrooms. And it also banned books such as Occupied America, Rethinking Columbus, The Tempest, Bless Me Ultima, and one of our college favorites, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Now, it's interesting that we have, Mexican Americans who are teaching something and who are accused of nationalism, if it's a bad thing, but we have a non-brown person in a non-brown house who is declaring nationalist ideology and is being celebrated for it. Moving on. So, are we in a continuous loop in higher education? Have educational institutions fully integrated, or are we still in a process of desegregation? How is our educational system still killing the culture to save the people? How can people from historically disenfranchised communities work from within to change the institution? Now, if our answers are yes to this, then what is this justice in action consist of? Can we shift the paradigm, and if so, towards what? And to quote Audre Lorde, a phenomenal activist, educator, philosopher, organizer, at a 1980s predominantly white female feminist conference, she asked the question, can the master's tools dismantle the master's house? So I'm going to stop here and open up to conversation just to sort of see what's kind of engaged at this time. And folks, if you have questions on Zoom, please feel free to chime in, raise your hand, or use the chat box.
Okay, I have the microphone, and in order to get this So that Eric can hear you, I would like for you to raise your hand so I can come to you. I'd ask that you speak in the mic. Comments or questions here in Springfield? They were in awe, Eric. Dr. Herzog.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric. I thought that was a wonderful presentation, and I'm glad I was able to squeeze some time to be here today. I think Audre Lorde actually said the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So I don't know that it was a question so much, although I know you chose to phrase it that way. So what are the tools that we might talk about and work with to change Springfield College in the positive ways that you've been suggesting through your talk? That people in the room may have ideas, but I'd love to hear what you've thought about as well.
Sure. Thank you. And yes, so Audre Lorde did pose it as a declarative statement at that 1980s feminist conference. And a little context about that was that she was invited at the last minute to present about her experience being both African and lesbian. She was not asked to be a scholar, an intellectual, or an advocate. She was invited to speak about her experience. And so she found out when she got to the conference that her and one other African-American female were invited at the last minute for a show of diversity. So Audre Lorde had said, you know, instead of talking about her experience, she turned this essay into a critique of feminism, the absent signifier is white feminism. And so she called to question what feminism was really doing to uphold white racial supremacy and patriarchy. So yeah, thank you for clarifying that for me. So, you know, there's a lot of things I think can be done. The next slide that I had showed up that I didn't talk about is going to be, I'll bring it up for myself at least. But, you know, I really think we need to understand how justice and liberation need to be the cornerstone of higher education. You know, currently it serves as a pillar. You know, we have a division for diversity and inclusion. Many institutions have vice chancellors or VPs or chief diversity officers who serve as a pillar for the institution. But a pillar upholds something. A pillar contributes to the foundation of something. But I believe we have to move away from, or we have to not move away from, but we have to include and embed within the fabric of our identity, justice and liberation. It's far too often that we've seen in society in the 1980s, moving up to even now, how the co-optation of diversity language has been used now against us. Language such as multiculturalism, diversity and inclusion, these words have been diluted to such a capacity. You know, they're being used as a scapegoat for folks who feel disenfranchised by the disenfranchised. So I think really we need to see this built into the fabric of our existence, from our mission statements to our having culturally relevant curriculum, to having faculty at the core of their identity politics and at the core of decisions about what faculty are going to teach in and outside of the classroom and things that impact their professional practice. I also think that we can't keep looking to, you know, chief diversity officers and ethnic studies or social sciences programs as the natural heavy lifters of this work. We need chief financial officers, we need deans, we need VPs, provosts, and board members who have the same type of language, you know, who can speak with authority and conviction, have both the experiential and the intellectual rigor to really push for this type of justice work. And, you know, and saying that really kind of made me think to myself about a year ago what my professional trajectory was going to be. Because I always thought for some time that I would be, you know, another Dr. Hill, you know, Vice President, Diversity and Inclusion, or Chief Diversity Officer. And I thought to myself, well, I continue to grow, and my cultural competency always needs to be enhanced and grown and challenged and questioned and affirmed. But I think to myself, you know, with the command of what I know from my experiential knowledge, my academic training and professional practice, why not leverage these ideas in student services, in academic affairs, not just within the house of diversity and inclusion? Because one, then that burden just seems to be on Dr. Hill. You know, why not have a chief financial officer or chief academic officer that works in alignment with Dr. Hill's work, or any other diversity officer, so that we are all sharing in this language and discourse, that everything we do at the meetings that we start, how we recruit, how we support, from our marketing and communications to the classroom, pedagogy and andragogy, recognizing that students as not only learners, but producers of knowledge is important. So everything from how we raise funds for the institution to who we receive funds from for the institution. I mean, everything I think is important that we kind of call into question. Knowing what we've come from as a history of higher ed, we really have to think for ourselves, are we at a place that we're serving our populations in a way that recognizes and honors and affirms their identities?
Thank you. Hi, Eric. Thank you so much for your presentation. And to my esteemed colleague who asked the question that drew your reply. We understand that our youth are 20% of our population, but 100% of our future. So posing your workshop in the various questions, what would you propose with that in mind with our School of Education? Since we are preparing adults that will impact the spirit, minds, and body of youth.
Yes, thank you. So I will say, I think that it's very, and I actually, after I answer, I'd love to sort of pass these questions along to the other members of the audience as well. But one is that, for those of you that have been at Springfield for quite some time, you may remember Bobby Harrow. Dr. Harrow wrote The Cycle of Socialization and The Cycle of Liberation. These were two cornerstone texts in the field of social justice education. And what these two charts or these models did was really talk about the way in which from the very beginning, from inception to creation of a person's birth to the formation of their critical ideology, they're shaped by their immediate surroundings. And so in terms of how the College of Education and how we can prepare educators in the K through 12 system or early childhood, I think it's important, one, for them to understand how a person's identity is formed and how their social identities are being linked into who they are and how they claim to be. And then asking parents to get involved in the process of understanding and dismantling this cycle of socialization that perpetuates racist ideologies or perpetuates methods and systems that continuously disenfranchise people. So one, I think it's through getting folks who are woke and critically conscious to help lead these discussions in these departments about, well, if we know that a child from birth is already being socialized and these social identities are already being linked to their bodies, physical and figurative bodies, then we have to help educators educate parents, help parents understand their role in dismantling these forms of oppression. And we have to dislodge ourselves from curriculum that has been passed down from generations. Actually, the College of Educations as a field have done really great work in challenging the way we understand early childhood education. And I think that's a very powerful thing for us to keep in mind for ourselves, is that this is something that we can't just start at colleges. This isn't something we can start in secondary schools. This has to be a groundswell, vertical, top-down, bottom-up, horizontal, diagonal, groundswell of social change. So we not only can look to higher education, but we have got to look to community-based knowledge. We have got to look at where we invest our dollars with the governments and how we channel and support different communities. But for the role of higher education, it should be always, first of all, to self-critique, recognize where we fall short, and then make our impact known in this country. Does anybody else want to kind of add to that or answer what's being said?
So we're going to pause right there. Is there anyone on one of our regional campuses? I see Pete Brown. I know that you all were at the mic earlier. Do you have a question for her?
Well, I make a comment.
You're on.
I'm on?
Yes.
Well, I'm here, so my colleagues are with me. Aaron, thank you very much for your talk. Yeah, everything you said, I kept nodding my head to. And I feel a little discouraged, maybe it's the political time that we're living in, that we have taken giant steps backwards in this country. And I wonder, where do we go from here? Right? I kind of, and I talk with a lot of other African-American women who, we're at a point where we don't want to leave our house. there's this constant sense of threat. And yet, I think talking about diversity, talking about having people think critically is important, but I've actually heard people say, why do we need to talk about diversity? We have diversity. We're good. And we Black and brown people know that we're not good.
Yeah. Thank you for that question, those comments. You know, we had a town hall on my campus this past weekend, and you know, about some topics that are impacting the Houston campus. And you know, some of our students had said, he's like, well, why are we even having this conversation? Like what purpose will it serve for us to speak about how we feel? Or, you know, and that kind of troubled me a little bit, because I thought to myself, well, you know, our school has a very clear mission statement to work towards achieving social and economic justice. I mean, our core curriculum within PCS is all about justice-related work, you know, and so, but it reminds me back to Bobby Harrell's work that we have been conditioned in cycle of socialization that continues to press us to enforce these ideologies that keep us in alignment. And when we fall out of alignment, then we are punished for not following this cycle of socialization. And so I think that and it's not easy, because I mean, as you know, it's not easy because fear is a very real thing in this country right now. I mean, we're seeing people shot and killed, murdered, burned, you name it, raped, and on a daily basis. And it is scary and troublesome. But I go back to what my mentors in higher education have been, and they've all been women of color. And so they have talked with me, and they always told me, you know, one is to never acquiesce, excuse me, to never to acquiesce your voice, you know, and to never cede your center. You know, we have been marginalized for way too long as people of color, as women, LGBT, people of different religious faiths, etc. We have been marginalized, we have been targeted, and we have pushed outside of our center. And that reminds me, that tells me, and actually the title of my dissertation was Expressions of Another Center. As here we are thinking that there's one center of discourse, there's one meta-narrative, there's one history, capital H, that documents and tracks the existence of this country and of this world. And to not challenge that means to reinforce my erasure, and to reinforce the violence that's taking place within my community and against communities that I am in solidarity with. Excuse me. So one is that, you know, we have to be able to find spaces that give us that safety, whether it's a faith-based, whether it's communities of like-minded folks. We have to acknowledge that fear is real, and it comes from perpetrators that are literally trying to kill people and to hurt people. But then to say next is that, you know, we can't stop there. I mean, too many of our ancestors have fought too far and hard and long, and have sacrificed so much for us to be able to even have this conversation today. I mean, could a brown guy from San Antonio have spoken this kind of stuff 20 years ago, 30 years ago? So one is that, you know, we have to acknowledge the fear that we have. We cannot dwell in that fear. We cannot take residence in that fear and that worry, and we must continue to fight. And it is done in unity. And for those of you that receive emails from me, we have to do that in solidarity with each other.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Excellent. Any other comments from any of our regional campuses? Saying that, we're going to pass it back to our Springfield campus. Other thoughts for Eric? Okay, so Eric, I'm going to ask you a quick question. I hope it's quick anyway. You talk about race and place in the ivory tower, and I'm thinking about the history and the role of our historically Black college universities, our tribal colleges, as well as our Hispanic serving institutions. Do we do our students of color a disservice by having them come to predominantly white institutions when we know that there is a sense of validity and so forth for students that attend institutions where they're represented both in the faculty, the president, you know, all those people that you spoke about, the chief financial officers, the deans of students? Do we do them a disservice by coming or ensuring that they're coming to predominantly white institutions like Springfield College?
Well, one, I think that strategically there's a lot of power and a student making a decision to go to a predominantly white institution, because we in a sense are disrupting that narrative of predominantly whiteness, you know, and we're claiming new space for ourselves. So one, there's power in that, and I think we have to acknowledge that opportunity. But HBCUs, like for example, in tribal colleges, were created because of lack of access, lack of resources and opportunity. So those are a groundswell of much organizing and social change within higher education. So I think that is important, because not everybody wants to take up the banner of entering into and trying to change a predominantly white space. Some people's calling in life might be to help reinvigorate HBCUs and tribal colleges, to, you know, to push that agenda forward and to create new and different models. Because ultimately, whether it's a predominantly white institution, a HBCU, an HSI, or a tribal college, all of these are still descendants of a very troubled higher education. A higher education that is in need of massive, not renovation, without scaring people, because I see my boss in the room. I'll say that I think we really need to work on structural transformation, and, you know, even questioning the structure itself. You know, is the ivory towers, I mean, is painting the ivory tower a different color really going to change the system? You know, is putting people of color in these positions going to change the system? That's my question, is can we change it from within?
Good thoughts. Other questions or thoughts here from Springfield? Other thoughts from any of our regional campuses? Eric, we're going to give it to you to give us our parting words.
Thank you. So I'll say this, that every year at our graduation here in Houston, we have, I give a speech. And I always include this speech in whatever iteration, this paragraph in whatever iteration I rewrite my speech for graduation. And I think that this paragraph is a very helpful way for us to kind of end the conversation today. And I'll read it to you, and then I'll say my thank yous. I am reminded by a few words by feminist scholar activist Bell Hooks. She writes, "The classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. In that field of possibility, we have the opportunity to labor for freedom, to demand of ourselves and our comrades an openness of mind and heart that allows us to face reality, even as we collectively imagine ways to move beyond boundaries, to transgress. This is education as the practice of freedom." So folks, I really believe that we're called to do this work in solidarity with each other. Our collective call to action really must be having a desire to build bridges that unite and not divide us, to practice a revolution of love, hope, and possibility, and to create change that is transformative, sustainable, and liberating. So thank you all so much. I appreciate you all taking time in that wet and rainy and cold time at Springfield College to come today. I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to share some perspective, and I hope I did PCS and my regional campuses proud today.
Definitely.
You surely did, Eric. Thank you.
Bob, if you have a comment? No? Okay. All right. So thank you so much for coming out and supporting Eric, and thank you so much for coming out. We've got one Pride Talk to go before the end of the year. So please make sure that you mark that on your calendars. That Pride Talk will take place here at 10 o'clock. And what is the date for that next Pride Talk? Sorry, it's slipped my mind. So we're going to get you that date here in just a second. December 11th. So before you get ready for those holidays, December 11th, please make sure that you're back and joining us for our last Pride Talk of the semester. Yes.
It's recording, so are the earlier talks recorded and we can get them online?
Yes, they are. So the earlier talks are recorded. This talk will also be available if you go to the Inclusion Community Engagement website. We typically take about, or the PrideNet page, so go to the PrideNet Inclusion Community Engagement website. But it usually takes about a week or so for us to get the file up and posted. But the prior two talks are posted. Eric, your talk will be posted hopefully by mid next week, so that you can share that with colleagues and friends as well. But thank you so much. Yes?
May I just ask him to share with us the name of that? Eric, may I ask that the name of the person whose quote you used in your closing graduation ceremony?
Yes.
Books. Okay.
Bell hooks. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I do. I thought it was her, but I didn't hear him say it.
All
Thank you.
right. So Eric, thank you so much. And enjoy that warm 40-degree weather there in Houston.
Yes.
We've got snow coming here Thursday, so enjoy yourself.
Awesome. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks to everybody.